If you've driven down Middlesex Turnpike in Burlington, you may have noticed this odd cottage set off from the road, seemingly out of place compared to what's around it. This is Kent Cottage, and it's been here since the 1850s, made for a wealthy beer brewer and his wife. It's been empty for a long time now. The windows are boarded up, and it's kind of falling down a little. And the saga of who would rescue this property and what would become of it has been fascinating Burlington residents for a long time. In today's edition of In Depth from BNEWS, we're checking in on Kent Cottage, why it's still empty, and what might become of it. But first, let's dive into the history of this fascinating building. I'm here with Robert Fahey, who writes Burlington Retro and has written pretty significantly about Kent Cottage. Robert, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So you've been following, researching, writing about Kent Cottage for a bunch of years now. What about this building got under your skin?
The fact that it's tucked away in such an odd location. It's in the wrongest place possible in town, and it's not even faced toward the road. It seems like it's kind of shyly tucked in the corner, playing, "Please don't look at me and don't ask about me." Well, naturally, that's the kind of thing that you want to ask about, and so it occurred to me that, since I already had a Burlington history-related channel, I said, okay, this is the murkiest little corner of town. That's the murkiest property. I need to get the biggest lights and shine it on that, because this is going to be the biggest nut to crack, is that one right there. And no one knew anything about it. I mean, not even what it's called, nothing. So I said, all right, who owns the property? It turned out Peter Norblom. And he didn't know much about it either. He inherited it. It fell into his lap. He knew a guy named Gary Drinkwater, though, who had a clothing store. He was related to one of the Burns family, who was the last family to actually occupy the house. And so through a lot of, he knows someone, the phone number, and trying, finally ended up with someone in the Burns family who was able to give me a little bit of information. And it turned out that a guy named James McGregor Burns, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and a professor at Williams College, used to live there. And the people at Williams College, there were a couple of librarians who were nice enough to do a lot of work and dig up a box of stuff from James McGregor Burns, from his upbringing in that house, old photos. So between their help, because otherwise I would have had to drive to Williams town to dig up that box. So they did the work, and they sent me a lot of stuff. And Alouette, the last living human being who can tell you about Kent Cottage, who actually slept there, who's still alive, she's super helpful. Her cousin Deb Burns, the daughter of James McGregor Burns, super helpful. So slowly I was able to piece it together and get some good images. Now this is back in when photography nowadays, everyone has a camera in their pocket. I'm going back to a time when you didn't photograph things. And if you did, it probably wasn't you at your house. It was something more important than that. So it was a miracle that I got all these photos. Just routine life in that building, is having dinner in the porch and playing tennis and stuff. I got it all.
So in some ways you stumbled upon a time capsule to another era in Burlington.
Yeah.
So before we get a little further into the history of the building, sort of tracing its past, I wonder if you could take us there. Describe a little more in depth what the outside of the house looks like. Maybe you're driving past it on the turnpike. What do you see, and what does that exterior tell us about that time?
You see the side of what appears to be like maybe a town-owned water plant or something. Like you see these granite structures that are turned out to be some a well or something that's not a house. So at first glance you might say, oh, I don't know what that was, but it's probably not someone's house, or it never was someone's house. Well, yeah, it was. It's just that it's turned away from the road. So you're looking at the side of the house. And it's made of huge granite blocks, and it's got no yard really. There's a little tiny patch of grass where Mother Nature hasn't yet invaded, although it's happening, it's slowly invading. There's no driveway. There's no evidence of any habitation. So it's hard to conceive of it as a household. But if you go back and get the old photos, all of a sudden you say, oh, I see. It was, this area in front of the house was clear. And there was a tennis court, and there was a pond not far up back that was for boating and skating and all this great, it was great. And next to it, there was the farmland. There were no businesses, but farmland with little animals and stuff. So it was a really pretty setting. It was built by a guy from England named John Kent, who was in the beer business, and wanted to recreate a cottage from England. So he hired some people to do it in that style from old England.
He built it for his second wife, is that right?
Yeah.
An English woman who left him shortly afterwards.
Yeah.
Which
so, thumbs down from didn't work. The desired effect didn't work.
Right. He wanted to build this house for her, and then
to charm her didn't work out.
Yeah.
So he must have been really unpleasant anyway.
So, but I mean, that's interesting, right? This man builds this house for his wife. She leaves him, and then you sort of dug up this history. It changes hands for a while.
Quite a bit.
And it was sort of like a bachelor pad for a little while. It seems like it served a number of uses.
Back when towns didn't really pay careful attention to properties and regulate them and monitor them and be nosy, it was just kind of a flop house, I guess. Cab drivers would just stay there, and it was just kind of an empty house that people would use for whatever they wanted. And then finally a woman from Melrose, Mildred Burns, had just divorced her husband and came here with her three little boys, Carl, Robert, and James. And I got pictures of them on the website too, and fishing in the little pond. She decided to move to the country with them to get country life. She was not into the suburbs and the one-upsmanship from her house, from her
Seems like
upbringing.
she was kind of a free spirit, a little bit unusual for her time.
Yeah. And she took her kids and rescued them from that, moved her out to the country to just raise them by herself. And one of them turned out to be James McGregor Burns, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. And that's how I got his box of his childhood photos in Williams College. And that cracked it open. That cracked open the whole colorful history.
And then it was his brother, Robert, who lived at the cottage and raised his kids there. And one of those kids is Alouette, is that right? Yeah,
that's right. And she was the last person who can tell you firsthand about the house, because unfortunately a heart defect ran in her family and wiped out her mother, sisters, her daughter. She has it also, but she's still alive. But she's the only person alive who can point to that house and say, that was my childhood home. One person.
So you spoke with her, you met with her. She's a grief and trauma counselor in New Hampshire, and she has these memories. So I wonder, I took the liberty of printing out something that you wrote that she wrote and shared with you, and I wonder if you could share a little bit of that with us.
I loved that house. When my grandmother Mildred bought it, it had been used as a retreat for a cab drivers union, and I understand that it was kind of a bachelor pad. Random cab drivers would show up late night looking for a friendly place to stay, not realizing that it had changed hands. My family moved there when my mother was pregnant with me. Talia was 10 and Claire 12. I was born on Talia's 11th birthday. My father built an addition adjoining the big stone house and moved us in. Yeah, so if you look at the side of the house, there is an addition at the opposite end of the turnpike, and that was built for her, and that's her bedroom window up there in that little section. It had steam radiators in the bedrooms. One winter night, my radiator froze and burst, so there was a skating rink on my floor when I got up in the morning. Of course, I was enchanted. My parents less so. There were 100 or so acres, as I recall. My father planted 1,000 Scotch pines every year for 10 years, planning to sell them off as Christmas trees. He also planted an evergreen tree on the day I was born. It was always Alouette's tree, but of course we couldn't take it with us when we moved. Our nearest neighbor was a pig farm within walking distance for a small child, and I would sometimes walk over there to admire the piglets. I would sometimes walk in the Scotch pine forest too. They were planted carefully in a grid, and the ground was carpeted with their dried needles, so it was a soft place to walk. I think there are some of those trees still left behind the Primrose School. Down the street on the turnpike, there are some very organized, very distinctive kind of monoculture trees. That's probably the remnants of her dad's tree farm.
It's amazing.
Still there.
It sounds like her time at Kent Cottage was really important to her.
Yeah. And also to her uncle, James McGregor Burns. He's very, very fond memories from that house.
So how did it end up abandoned?
Well, it fell into the hand, let's think now. It changed hands several times, but RCA owned it.
The Radio Corporation of America.
Yeah, it fell into their hands. They had no use for it. They used it as a storage facility, and they kind of ruined the place. In fact, there's a picture on my site of a bunch of Bradley fighting vehicles training right across the street from it, and it was all boarded up. So, and then it fell into the hands of Nordblom Company, who, again, just like RCA, they kind of inherited it, and they're just kind of leaving it weather tight as best they can and trying to prevent Mother Nature from destroying it, but of course Mother Nature will ultimately win. And so it's in limbo.
What would you want to see for this property? What's your dream future for this?
If it's possible to move it, it would be nice to move it to a pastoral setting and try to recreate what used to be there. I don't know if there's a business case for that. First of all, it has to be a business case for everything. I don't know what the business case is to move it. Who would take custody of it? If it's possible to move such a structure, I'm sure that thing is heavy and awkward and difficult to keep intact if you try to move it. Also, the ground there might be soggy because you've got wetlands not far from there, so I don't know how you get under it. So I don't know much about that whole topic, but it seems like it can't happen. Turning it into a wedding venue or like a function hall sounds nice too, except you have to park people, and you can't put parking on that property that would be sufficient, and you can't put them across the street and have them cross Middlesex Turnpike. And I don't think Nordblom would want to rent out a part of their parking lot for that. So the best you can do is nothing, which is what's happening now. Just leave it the way it is.
Is that a satisfying answer?
No, but there is no satisfying answer. That's the closest you can come to any kind of culturally or historically satisfying outcome is don't do anything and just let it sit there. I'd like to see a sign on it that says Kent Cottage, 1860, or John Kent, 1860 something, so that people driving by would look at it and maybe look it up later and learn about it. You can't have an informational plaque there because there's no sidewalk, and even if there were, no one walks on Middlesex Turnpike, especially that end. So I guess my preference would don't do anything with it and put a sign on it that's legible from the turnpike. That's it.
How long do we have until the inexorable march of time sort of reclaims?
I don't know. That's a granite. I mean, that's made of. That's a pretty sturdy structure. Except the roof is obviously not stone. But I don't know the answer. I don't know enough about it. But probably a long, long time.
You're a historian, a local preserver of what we have, of records, of documentation.
Yeah.
What for you is the moral or the ethical case for preserving physical structures and documents of what's gone?
Well, I believe in documenting things, but not necessarily preserving everything, because you can't. Time changes, things change, that's okay. As long as you have properly documented what was there so other generations can learn, it's okay. Some things you can preserve in a meaningful way. For instance, Grandview Farm up on the Common. That was a good move. But that's because the context hasn't changed a lot. It's still open, it's still green, so it's not crazy to have what appears to be an old farmhouse in that area. It still makes sense today. So that was a good move that the town did. They kind of froze it in time and said, here, this is part of our culture, part of our history. We'll leave it right there, and it still makes sense in the context. Kent Cottage, you can't do that. You can't make it into a single-family household with a quaint landscape around it. It'll never happen. Another example of what you can't do is Reed Hamworks, which is just beyond Lacache's on the right as you're approaching Billerica. You pass by Lacache's, then there's this building. It used to be there until recently. It was a big kind of light blue building, and it was used for a lot of things. But at the beginning, it was Reed Hamworks, a ham and bacon processing facility, and it was the only substantial business that we had before 128 came and turned us from agricultural to industrial. So how do you preserve that? As what? As a ham processing facility? Where's the business? Always you have to ask, where's the business case? Where's the money? You know, do you make it a ham museum? Would you take your kids to a ham museum?
I might be in the minority because I absolutely would, but I see what you're saying.
Besides crazy people like you, Okay, who would do that? So there's an example of something that you really can't preserve either. So Burlington, and also another problem with Burlington is we don't have a town center. Most towns have some clearly defined, you can draw a circle around some area that is definitely the center, and if you want to get a bunch of like-minded people together who are willing to maybe give up a little bit of money, but for the sake of culture, preserve a certain area, that's great. Every town around us has exactly that. We don't. We have the Common, we have Simons Park, yeah, except there's no shopping there. There's the new shops at Simons Park, but that's not really shopping. If you look at what's in there, and that's not really accessible, kind of. Then you've got a long downhill, about a quarter mile anyway, which is not conducive to a town center, having a long hill with woods on one side also, that's not conducive to a town center. Then you've got a pedestrian hostile area down where Shaw's is, and Papagino's and all that stuff. How many pedestrians do you see down there?
Not a whole lot.
No, you'll die. So we don't have a town center. And that makes it difficult to think in terms of preservation because there's nothing to preserve except a couple of little isolated patches. We just get rid of a really old house down on Lexington Street before you get to the mall. On the left, it was an old house, gone now.
So what I hear you saying is preserve what makes sense to preserve.
Yeah.
And sometimes...
If the context can evoke the past, great. Grandview Farm, good example. If you can't preserve it, like Kent Cottage, you have to sit there and twiddle your thumbs until it goes away. Either it goes away because it gets renovated, and when you renovate, by definition, you change it. And that's not preserving, that's the opposite of preserving, right? You don't renovate something if you're preserving it. So when you renovate it, you've cut the ties to the past, it's over. If you knock it down, it's gone also. So all we can do now is admire it while it's there, and it's either going to be knocked down or it's going to completely change and be unrecognizable. So,
Robert Fahey, thank you very much.
thank you, ma'am.
I'm here with Todd Fremont Smith of Nordblom Companies, here to talk more about the present of Kent Cottage. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I want you to take us there in your mind. If you imagine Kent Cottage, what sticks out to you visually? What's noticeable to you?
Well, clearly it's a beautiful English-style country stone house that's massively juxtaposed inside a high-tech business park, right? So in 2007, when we bought the Sun Microsystems East Coast campus, which in itself was a feat to get control of that, it came along with not just 1 million square feet of commercial office space, but it came with this little house. And it was always a curiosity and a beautiful building, but we really didn't know what to do with it because it was outside of our wheelhouse in terms of turning that campus into a multi-tenant campus from a single-tenant campus, rezoning it, investing a lot of money in the office campus. And then we had this little tiny cottage. We couldn't figure out what to do with it because it was only 2,400 square feet. It has very limited parking due to the conservation issues that surround the house. And we tried to think about, should it be an American Express office? Should it be a Starbucks? Should it be a micro brew pub? All of those things fell down either because of the lack of parking, because we can only get about 40 parking spaces on the site, and a restaurant needs like 150 spaces, just in commercial terms, to make it viable. Or it fell down because the building was so small that the $2 million necessary to renovate the building was too much of a burden on that small office opportunity. So we did have interested users, but it just never seemed to get off the ground. So back in 2021, so about 2 years ago, we went to town meeting. I went to town meeting and I asked the town meeting, could we build up to 9 condominiums, townhouses, 2 of which would be located in the Kent Cottage. So 7 plus 2 is our thought. And the town meeting approved that because it meant that there would be a financial engine that could renovate the cottage. And we presented them with a site plan and with a rendering, which I can share with you, that shows the finished product. We've not been quick about doing it just because the turmoil in the housing market, interest rates. We've been trying to find the right partner because frankly, we don't build single family homes. And so we need to find the right local partner, which we think we are doing. So there have been a bunch of, and meanwhile we've been doing the Broad Institute and Vericel and all these other high-tech companies across the street at the main Network Drive campus, which we've since rebranded Blue Sky Burlington to signify the sort of mountaintop, hilltop nature of the site, but also the fact that there are companies up there that are reaching for the stars and creating new things.
I hope you'll forgive me for asking, but I can imagine someone who was maybe at that town meeting 2 years ago and looking at the site not having changed any now and wondering, is this really going to happen?
So all I can tell you is we remain committed to doing it. We've talked about it as recently as last week in my office, trying to find the right development partner to do it. It still needs to go through site plan approval and through conservation approval. I think that's going to be the next step. So sitting here today, as a corporate citizen of Burlington, I do think it's going to happen. We were asking ourselves as recently as a couple weeks ago, should it be a microbrewery? Should it be a restaurant? But again, we've come back to that problem with just not enough parking. So I think we've got the right vision for the site, and we've got the zoning for the site. So I do think it will happen.
I think that the other piece of it that's interesting to me about Kent Cottage, and I imagine it's interesting to other folks as well, is this tension between preservation and renovation.
Yes.
That this is a historic site. It's architecturally interesting, and it has this economic potential.
Right.
So how do you balance those two incentives?
You try to work with it. So it's historically important. It's not historically protected. So there are no restrictions on it. But as stewards of the building, and as, again, I go to town meeting for all kinds of things, and I told town meeting we were going to renovate this building. So you will see a thoughtful renovation with an architect that understands what he or she's dealing with. You will see, expensive windows, expensive roofing. This will not be a low-end renovation, but it really needs to be taken back to the frame. I'm not even sure that the structure of the building is sound.
It's kind of a mess in there.
So it's kind of a mess in there, and I have a photograph I can share with you as well. But it needs a massive renovation. It's not a small renovation. So that's why we're proposing to build some other houses nearby to create the financial engine, as I said, to push that forward.
And it's true, Burlington does need some housing. So there's a
So
benefit.
I think in general, we're all aware that there's a housing crisis. I don't think it's normal that single-family starter homes are $750,000 or $800,000. So, we're building 163 units right now on 4th Avenue, right with Lifetime Fitness, right in front of Lifetime Fitness. We know that those are going to be taken up immediately. The people who live at Northwest Park today, they love it. We've got Wegmans, we've got restaurants, we've got fitness, we've got walking trails. So we know that model works, and we think that's the right location in town to be building housing. Clearly, this is 9 units, right? So it's not going to solve the demand equation, the supply equation rather. But we do think that by building more housing, whether it's under the MBTA Communities Act, which is forthcoming, whether it's under Friendly 40B, which the town has done, in the commercial areas of Burlington, we think it's the right thing to do because something like 50% of the people who live at Northwest Park work in Burlington, which is a very high number. Typically in a multifamily building, people work everywhere, but a very high proportion of the people who live at Northwest Park work in the actual town.
Do you have a sense for the kind of price point that you might be looking at for those? I know it's early, but
yeah, it's too early for me to say. It's going to be. Hopefully we can get back what we spend on it.
Right. That's
So these renovation costs are very expensive. Small projects are very expensive. This is not how we make a living. So doing 9 condos we just want to make sure it's done right. We'd like to try not to lose money on it, but again, it's part of a 1 million square foot office campus. So we just need to make sure it's done the right way.
Cool.
Yeah.
Todd Fremont-Smith, thank you very much for taking a couple minutes.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
All right, I'm here with John Keeley, Conservation Administrator for the town of Burlington, here to talk about the conservation component of Kent Cottage. John, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So in this conversation, I've spoken with Todd Fremont-Smith about the present situation for Kent Cottage and Robert Fahey about the history of the cottage. And I want to talk to you about the issues around conservation.
Okay.
So from the perspective of a conservation administrator, when someone, whether it's Nordstrom or Nordblom companies or anyone else talks about developing this property, what goes through your mind? What concerns do you have from a conservation perspective?
So we've had several filings on that property in the past, so I'm pretty familiar with it. There's been a couple of remediation projects from contamination from across the street. We also permitted in, I think, 2016, a previous proposal for a commercial business. It was a printing company that was going to restore the Kent Cottage itself and demolish the non-historical addition, and then construct, I think, something like a 4,000 square foot modern office building around it, so that the Kent Cottage still had the visibility from the street. And unfortunately, after the permits were all issued, the project went away. The company just, I think, had financial difficulties. So I've dealt with that property several times. The property itself has a small amount of upland area that can be built on. It's got two brooks that border it, one on the left, and then Vine Brook is to the rear. There's also extensive wetlands, and there's extensive floodplain. So the actual footprint of buildable land on the property is fairly limited, which makes it difficult to put any structure of any size there and have sufficient parking.
Can you say more about the remediation issues? Sure.
I can't remember now the company that owned the land before Sun Microsystems was built, but they had contamination issues, and the plume of mitigation traveled quite a way, and there was actually a pond out behind the Kent Cottage, or actually just to the north of the Kent Cottage, that they actually had to go out and dredge a bunch of sediments out of. That would have probably been, I don't know, maybe 2005, 2006, somewhere around there. And so subsequently, they've also gone in and put in monitoring wells and whatnot to monitor the contamination.
But it seems like things are sort of managed right now fairly well.
And it's this whole site is overseen by a licensed site professional.
Okay. This building, I think, kind of obsesses people because it's architecturally interesting. It shows us a time and a place in Burlington that we don't necessarily have access to anymore. But there's also a possibility of redeveloping it. So from a conservation perspective, I don't know, is there more value over preserving it as a historical structure versus redeveloping it, just sort of in terms of the intrinsic value of either of those things, regardless of what the company or the developer is? Does that make sense?
Right. I mean, I think for the community there is. I mean, the Conservation Commission's jurisdiction is really wetland protection, not conservation of historical properties. I think for the greater community, there's a lot of value in maintaining the existing structure, renovating the interior, because the interior I hear is in pretty bad shape, and then working around that, using that, and then just building around it with something obviously more modern.
What would be the best solution in terms of wetland conservation, do you think?
So the project would have to meet the standards of the Wetlands Protection Act and the wetland bylaws, which means the construction, which includes parking, it just can't come very close to the wetlands. It has to be set back a good distance, and then all the stormwater runoff from the parking lots and the roofs have to be handled according to our regulations.
John Keeley, thank you very much for taking a couple minutes with us.
My pleasure.
Thanks for following along as we dove into the past, present, and future of one of Burlington's most fascinating buildings. I'm your host, Sydney Bowles, and this has been BNEWS In Depth. Thanks for joining us.